The rain came down in relentless sheets, turning the cracked sidewalks of Chicago into glistening mirrors of neon and shadow. Emily Carter walked with her head low, hood pulled tight against the storm, the fabric of her scrubs clinging damply to her skin after a long shift at the hospital. The city was loud, even in the rain. Sirens wailing in the distance, the rumble of the train overhead, cars hissing through puddles. But still she felt the silence of her own life pressing down heavier than the weather. Then, as she crossed Halsted, she felt it, eyes on her. Her steps faltered, a whisper of instinct curling cold through her spine. Across the street, under the glow of a flickering street lamp, a man stood half hidden by shadow. He wasn't moving, wasn't trying to close the distance. He just watched her. And though she couldn't make out his face clearly through the rain, she knew, somehow, that his gaze wasn't casual. It wasn't the look of a stranger. It was recognition. Her stomach tightened. She quickened her pace, heart hammering, telling herself not to look again. But she couldn't help it. When her eyes met his across the slick street, the storm seemed to fall away, the city quieted, and a single terrible thought anchored itself in her mind. He knows me. The next morning, the storm had passed, leaving the city washed but still gray. Emily tried to shake off the unease from the night before, convincing herself it was exhaustion, paranoia, maybe just another man on another street in a city full of them. She dressed for her day off, made coffee, tried to let the warmth soothe her rattled nerves. But when she went to check the mailbox outside her small apartment building, her breath caught. Nestled among bills and grocery flyers was a single envelope. No return address. Her name written in deliberate, unfamiliar handwriting. Emily's fingers trembled as she tore it open right there in the hallway, the paper dampening slightly in her grip. The words inside seemed to blur as she read them. You still wake up at 3:17 a.m., don't you? You still hear the sound of the door breaking. You still wonder if you could have saved her. Emily froze. Her pulse roared in her ears. These were not vague guesses or cruel taunts. These were details, specific, intimate, about the one night she had buried so deep she had never spoken of it aloud. Not to her parents, not to her closest friend, not even in therapy. A night that lived like a scar in her bones, hidden but never healed. And here it was, bleeding onto the page in someone else's handwriting. Emily's knees weakened, and she pressed herself against the wall for balance, clutching the letter like evidence of a crime. Whoever had written it wasn't guessing. They knew, and that terrified her more than anything. The rest of the day passed in fragments. Emily couldn't focus on her coffee, couldn't focus on the comfort shows she played to fill the silence, couldn't even bring herself to pick up the phone and call the police. She kept rereading the letter, fingers brushing the paper as though she might discover a hidden fingerprint, a clue. Her rational mind screamed that this was dangerous, that she needed protection, but another part of her, the part that had lived in quiet torment since that night years ago, was whispering something else. What if he has answers? For so long, she had lived with questions she never dared voice. Why it had happened, who had known, why no one had believed her when she hinted at her pain. And now, suddenly, a stranger in the rain and a letter in her mailbox suggested that someone, somewhere, not only knew but had been watching. She hated herself for it, but the fear was laced with something sharper, almost magnetic. Curiosity, hunger. As evening fell, she found herself standing by the window, staring out at the street below, waiting for a shadow to move, a face to appear. When nothing came, she finally sank onto her couch, clutching the letter to her chest, a whisper escaping her lips before she even realized she'd spoken aloud. Who are you? And how do you know me? The words trembled in the air, unanswered, but already she knew this was no accident. This was only the beginning. Emily Carter's world was built around fluorescent lights, antiseptic smells, and the rhythm of night shifts that left her body weary and her spirit numb. The hospital was where she existed, not where she lived. Colleagues knew her as capable, quiet, and unfailingly professional, but outside of the emergency room, she disappeared into herself. She returned each morning to a modest apartment that felt more like a holding cell than a home. Walls bare, fridge half empty, television left on not for entertainment, but to drown out silence. Loneliness had become a second skin. Her phone stayed silent most days, except for automated appointment reminders or an occasional message from her younger sister Sarah that usually ended in bitterness rather than warmth. Their mother, still living in the small town where Emily grew up, had severed any real connection years ago. To her, Emily was the daughter who had failed, the one whose survival had come at too great a cost. The blame had never been spoken directly, but Emily had felt it in every pause, every averted gaze, every holiday spent alone. She wore her isolation as both punishment and protection, convinced she deserved neither forgiveness nor belonging. In this fragile existence, her routines, shifts at the hospital, coffee at dawn, the steady solitude of her apartment, were her only tether to normalcy. And it was this fragile balance that began to shatter the moment a man in the rain looked at her as though he had already read the darkest pages of her life. Emily's estrangement from her family was rooted in a single night that had carved her life into before and after. At 17, she had been driving home with her father on an empty stretch of road when headlights swerved into their lane. She still remembered the screech of tires, the shattering glass, and the suffocating silence afterward. When she woke in the hospital, she was alive. Her father wasn't. The official report called it an accident, unavoidable. But in the small town where she grew up, rumors metastasized quickly. Whispers spread that she had been distracted, reckless, that she had been the one to kill her father. None of it was true, but gossip had never cared about truth. Her mother, devastated and unable to untangle grief from blame, withdrew behind cold silences and cutting remarks. Sarah, still a child at the time, grew up with that same story curdling in her ears, that Emily had lived while their father had died. By the time Emily was old enough to leave, she fled without looking back, carrying the invisible weight of both survivors' guilt and the cruel suspicion of her hometown. Chicago was supposed to be a place to rebuild, to escape the judgment. But distance hadn't dulled the pain. Emily avoided returning for holidays, ignored most of her sister's calls, and buried herself in work. She lived in exile from her own blood, convinced that any attempt to reconcile would only reopen wounds. And yet, the letter proved that the past she had run from had found her again. In the vacuum of family, Emily's world held only a few steady figures. Detective Mark Reynolds, who often passed through the hospital for cases, had become a quiet presence in her life. With kind eyes and a patience she didn't think she deserved, he seemed to carry a steady affection for her, one he never pressed, only offered in small gestures. Emily noticed it, felt the warmth of it, but always kept him at a distance. To let him in would mean letting him see the broken pieces she fought to keep hidden. Sarah, meanwhile, remained tethered to their hometown, sending messages that alternated between longing and resentment. She couldn't understand why Emily had left, why she had chosen silence over sisterhood. And now, as though fate had decided Emily's careful isolation was too fragile, the stranger returned. His name was Daniel Hayes, though he offered little more. Older than Emily by at least a decade, his calm, almost deliberate composure unsettled her. He didn't threaten, didn't chase. He spoke in fragments that landed with the weight of truths she hadn't spoken aloud. It was as though he had stepped straight out of her past, carrying knowledge no one else should have. His presence was not loud but invasive, unsettling in its quiet certainty. Emily's carefully walled-off world, the night shifts, the solitude, the fragile balance of estrangement, was colliding with something larger, darker. And as she stared into his eyes, she realized that whatever this man knew, it wasn't just about her past. It was about her. The next time Emily saw Daniel Hayes, it was not by chance. He approached her outside the hospital in the early hours of dawn, when the city was caught between exhaustion and awakening. The air was cool, mist rising off the pavement, and she had just ended a brutal night shift when his voice, low, steady, cut through the fog. "I knew your father," he said, as though it were the most ordinary confession. The word struck her like a blow. For years, no one had spoken her father's name with familiarity, and now this stranger stood before her, claiming not just knowledge but connection. When she demanded proof, his hand slipped into his coat pocket and drew out an old photograph. Emily's breath caught. There was her father, alive, smiling, his arm around Daniel as though they were old friends. The date printed on the back chilled her more than the image itself. Months before the crash, at a time when her father was supposed to have been too consumed with work and illness to travel anywhere. "He wasn't the man you thought he was," Daniel said softly, his gaze unwavering. "And the accident wasn't an accident." Confusion warred with anger inside her. She wanted to scream at him, deny everything, rip the photo apart. But the truth was undeniable. Her father had known this man. And if that was true, what else had he hidden from her? The certainty she had clung to all these years began to unravel, thread by fragile thread. Unable to carry the weight of Daniel's revelation alone, Emily did something she hadn't done in years. She drove back to her mother's house. The familiar streets of her hometown felt suffocating, unchanged yet haunted by whispers she still remembered. Her mother greeted her stiffly, surprise flickering before retreating into practiced distance. When Emily showed her the photograph and demanded answers, her mother's face hardened, lines deepening as if age had arrived in a rush. "Let the past stay buried," she said, her voice sharp, final. It was not explanation but dismissal, a warning cloaked in bitterness. Sarah, overhearing, burst in from the kitchen, her expression raw with resentment. "This is what you do, Emily," she snapped. "You leave, and then you come back just to rip open wounds the rest of us learn to live with." The argument escalated quickly, Sarah accusing Emily of selfishness, of abandoning them. Emily insisting she only wanted the truth. Their mother's silence was worse than shouting. She refused to meet Emily's eyes, refused to acknowledge the photograph, as though denial could erase it. When Emily finally left the house, her sister's words echoed louder than the rain beginning to fall outside. For years, she had believed herself to be the black sheep, the one cast out. But now she understood something deeper. Her family wasn't just angry with her. They were hiding something, and they would rather lose her entirely than let it surface. Back in Chicago, Emily threw herself into research, chasing shadows in hospital archives and buried police reports. She pulled her father's medical records, finding gaps and inconsistencies, appointments that didn't exist, treatments never logged. Old police files on the crash revealed discrepancies she had never noticed, conflicting witness statements, missing timestamps, vague conclusions hastily drawn. It was as though the record itself had been scrubbed clean, leaving only fragments. Yet the deeper she dug, the more her own memory betrayed her. That night of shattered glass and sirens had always been blurred by trauma, but now she realized how much she couldn't trust. Did she really remember who was driving? The sound of the crash? The moments before the impact? Or had she been clinging to a narrative carefully constructed to protect her from something far darker? Exhaustion settled heavy on her, but adrenaline pushed her forward. And then, just when she felt the city itself was holding its breath, she found it. An envelope slipped under her apartment door. The handwriting stopped her heart. She recognized every curve, every stroke. It was her father's. With trembling hands, she opened it, her eyes devouring the words. They were brief, written in the voice of the man she thought she had lost forever. "Emily, if you're reading this, the truth has already found you. Trust no one." The room spun around her. Her father was dead. She had buried him. And yet his voice, his warning, was now alive in her hands. Emily cornered Daniel in a small coffee shop tucked away on a quiet street, rain streaking the windows as though the storm itself wanted to keep their meeting secret. Her voice was sharper than she intended, years of silence and doubt breaking open. "No more hints. No more riddles. Tell me how you knew my father." Daniel sat across from her, calm as always, his fingers resting lightly on the edge of his coffee cup, as if her fury were expected. "Because he asked me to protect you," he said, his tone measured, unflinching. The words lodged in her chest, equal parts comfort and terror. She demanded proof, demanded to know why her father had never spoken of him. Instead, Daniel leaned forward, lowering his voice as if speaking directly into her soul. "Your nightmares. The ones that wake you at 3:17. The sound of the door breaking, the shadow you never see before you wake up screaming." Emily froze, blood draining from her face. Those were secrets locked inside her, memories she had never shared with anyone. He spoke them with chilling precision, as though he had lived inside her mind all these years. The world tilted. Logic screamed he was dangerous, manipulative. But another part of her, the part that had longed for answers, leaned closer. Daniel wasn't just pulling her past into the light. He was holding pieces of herself she hadn't dared touch. And now she needed to know whether he was the protector he claimed to be or the predator she feared. The more Emily sought connection, the more doors slammed in her face. Sarah ignored her calls, sending only curt messages that read like accusations. "Stop dragging this up. Leave us alone." Her mother refused to answer altogether, as if silence were the only shield left. Even Detective Mark Reynolds, who had always been a steady presence, looked at her with wary eyes when she confided in him. He listened to her recount Daniel's claims, his face unreadable until finally he said, "Emily, this man knows too much. He could be dangerous. Don't let him in." She wanted to trust Mark, wanted to believe his care for her was enough, but his words only deepened her isolation. Because while everyone else urged her to forget, Daniel was the only one giving her fragments of the truth, even if those truths tore her apart. It left her stranded between two impossible choices: retreat into the safety of denial or step forward into the shadows Daniel carried. The tension with Sarah broke into confrontation when Emily drove back home unannounced. The fight exploded in their mother's living room, old resentments spilling like gasoline. Emily accused Sarah of knowing more about their father than she admitted. Sarah screamed back that Emily had abandoned them, left her to shoulder their mother's grief alone. Words turned sharp and cruel, and in the end, Emily stormed out, her sister's voice echoing in her ears. "You're the reason he's gone. You always were." The chasm between them had never felt wider. By the time Emily returned to Chicago, her world felt like it was collapsing in on itself. She sat alone in her apartment, clutching the letter in her father's handwriting, her thoughts spiraling between suspicion and desperate need. When Daniel appeared again, this time waiting outside her building, she didn't run. Instead, she demanded to know why he was doing this to her, why he knew things he shouldn't. His answer wasn't direct, but devastating. "Because the person who betrayed your father is closer than you think, and they've been lying to you your whole life." Emily's stomach turned. His words laced poison through every memory: her mother's coldness, Sarah's resentment, even Mark's protective warnings. Who could she trust if betrayal had lived inside her family all along? The fear twisted into anger, into a suffocating sense of being trapped. Yet beneath it all, something more dangerous stirred, the eerie sense that Daniel wasn't guessing. He seemed to know her in ways no one else ever had. He spoke with the cadence of her thoughts, anticipated her emotions before she voiced them. It was as if he had peeled back the layers of her grief, guilt, and fear and laid them bare in his hands. For the first time in years, Emily felt truly seen, and it terrified her. Was he her father's protector, or was he something far darker, entangled in the very fabric of her past? As she stared at him under the dim streetlight, one truth pressed cold against her heart. Daniel wasn't just in her life now. He was inside her. Emily's search through the archives finally delivered the answer she wasn't ready for. Hidden in the brittle pages of an old case file, buried beneath years of dust and bureaucratic neglect, she found her father's name, not as a victim, but as a subject of investigation. Sheriff Carter had been accused of corruption, suspected of colluding with local officials in a cover-up that touched the highest levels of their small-town government. But within the file, Emily also discovered something stranger: reports that he had been preparing to expose his colleagues, gathering evidence that could have shattered reputations and ended careers. The night of the crash was the night he was set to act. It wasn't just bad luck, it was a storm of secrets colliding. Shaken, Emily carried the file to Daniel, demanding an explanation. His reaction wasn't surprise, but sorrow. He confessed that he had been her father's closest friend, his partner in the fight to expose the truth. He had stayed away from her not out of neglect, but because he believed she deserved freedom from the shadows that had consumed her father. "He made me promise," Daniel said, voice steady but eyes clouded. "If anything happened, I was to watch from a distance. Protect you, even if it meant you'd hate me." For the first time, Emily saw him not as a stranger, but as a tether to the father she thought she had lost. His presence, once intrusive, now felt inevitable, like he had always been meant to resurface when the past demanded reckoning. Armed with the file and Daniel's confession, Emily confronted her mother one last time. The confrontation wasn't calm. It was a storm that had waited over a decade to break. She slammed the photograph onto the table, recited the case notes, and demanded to know the truth. Her mother, pale and trembling, finally cracked. Tears streaked her face as she whispered what Emily had never imagined. The crash hadn't been her fault. It was Sarah. On that night, Sarah had been sitting in the back seat, chattering, fighting for their father's attention. He had turned to answer her at the wrong moment, seconds before headlights tore through their lane. Their mother had carried that truth like a shield, lying to protect her younger daughter from guilt, burying Emily beneath the weight instead. "You were strong," her mother sobbed. "You could survive it." Sarah couldn't. The words sliced through Emily like glass. Every sleepless night, every cruel whisper in their hometown, every ounce of guilt she had borne, it had never been hers to carry. Her family had built her prison with silence, locking her in while protecting Sarah with lies. The revelation left her dizzy, her knees nearly buckling as decades of pain shifted beneath her. The life she had lived, the choices she had made, all of them had been carved by a lie. She staggered back from her mother, eyes burning, and realized her entire identity had been a cage constructed from betrayal. Her world didn't just collapse. It shattered. In the wake of the revelation, Emily walked out of her childhood home feeling like a ghost of herself. Betrayal coursed through her veins heavier than blood. Her mother's tears felt hollow, Sarah's absence a wound that would never close. For years, she had believed her family's silence was grief. Now she knew it was cowardice. The guilt she had nurtured, the shame that had shaped every step of her life, had been misplaced. And yet, instead of freedom, she felt hollow, unmoored, like a prisoner suddenly released into a world too wide, too cold. It was Daniel who found her sitting on the steps, her hands trembling as if the truth itself were poison. He didn't speak at first, only stood beside her, a presence steady and immovable. When he finally did, his words were quiet but devastating. "Now you understand why I stayed away. You deserved more than their lies." For reasons she couldn't explain, Emily felt her chest loosen at his voice. He knew her, the nightmares, the scars, the weight she carried, and unlike her family, he had never asked her to bury them. She should have pushed him away, should have feared the intimacy of his knowledge. Instead, she felt an unsettling relief, as though Daniel's presence was the only constant in a world suddenly crumbling. In that moment, she realized the cruelest irony of all. The stranger she had feared most was the only one who had never betrayed her. And that made him dangerous in a way her family never could be. The days that followed the revelation were quieter, but not easier. Emily found herself standing at a crossroads where silence was no longer an option. For the first time, she chose not to carry the shame that had been forced on her shoulders. She spoke openly, first to Sarah, then to her mother, laying the truth bare like broken glass on the table. Sarah, confronted by the weight of her role in their father's death, collapsed beneath it. Years of resentment gave way to sobs, her voice raw as she admitted the guilt she had carried in secret. "I thought if you left, it would be easier for me," Sarah confessed. "But it only made me hate myself more." Their mother, caught between her daughters, tried to hold the family together with trembling hands, urging forgiveness, urging unity. But Emily, for the first time in her life, set boundaries. She listened, she acknowledged their pain, but she refused to step back into the role of scapegoat. "The truth doesn't break us," she told them, her voice steady. "Lies do, and I won't live inside them anymore." It was not forgiveness, not yet, but it was a step forward, one where her voice finally mattered. For Emily, honesty became the foundation of her new life, a way to reclaim herself from the shadows of both guilt and betrayal. When Daniel returned to see her one final time, it was not with secrets, but with quiet closure. They met at the edge of the city, beneath a gray sky that mirrored the heaviness of parting. His eyes carried the weight of promises kept and burdens he could finally set down. "I told your father I would protect you until you could face the truth," he said, his tone soft but resolute. "That day has come." Emily searched his face, the man who had been both her torment and her guide, and felt a strange ache. He had unsettled her world, unraveled her pain, and yet, in the process, had given her the freedom to live without chains. For a fleeting moment, she wanted to ask him to stay, not as her father's shadow, not as a keeper of secrets, but simply as someone who had seen her completely. But she understood what his departure meant. His role was never to remain. It was to unearth what had been buried. And so, She let him go with respect, watching as he walked away into the rhythm of the city, not vanishing, but fading into the anonymity he had carried all along. The farewell wasn't loss, it was liberation. Daniel had been her father's promise, but now, at last, she was her own. In the weeks that followed, it was Detective Mark Reynolds who quietly filled the empty spaces Daniel left behind, not as a replacement, but as a presence grounded in steadiness. He didn't push, didn't press her with questions or declarations. Instead, he showed up, bringing her coffee on long mornings, walking with her through the noise of Chicago, sitting with her in silence when words felt too heavy. For the first time, Emily allowed someone to be by her side without fear of judgment. She shared pieces of her story, not in confessions of guilt, but as truths spoken aloud, freeing her from years of secrecy. Mark listened, not as a savior, but as someone who believed her worth was never tied to her past. It was in those quiet moments that Emily felt the slow rise of healing. Not dramatic, not immediate, but steady. She chose to return to work with renewed strength, no longer hiding behind walls of shame. At home, she replaced silence with honesty, even when it was hard, even when it reopened wounds with Sarah and her mother. She carried herself differently now, no longer haunted by the weight of a lie. Standing at her apartment window one evening, the city lights spread before her, Emily whispered to herself, "The truth is mine now." It was a promise, not to her father, not to Daniel, not even to her family, but to herself. For the first time in years, Emily Carter was free. Months had passed, the sharp edges of revelation softening into something less jagged but no less real. The cemetery was quiet that morning, the kind of stillness that pressed into the skin and demanded silence. Emily walked alongside Sarah, the rhythm of their steps oddly synchronized, though neither spoke. In her hands, Emily carried lilies, their father's favorite, while Sarah carried roses, red and heavy with dew. For the first time in years, there were no lies between them, no undercurrent of blame humming like static. The grave, simple and unadorned, stood waiting, a silent witness to the fractures and mending of a family. Sarah's hands trembled as she placed the roses down, whispering something Emily couldn't quite hear. Emily followed, lowering the lilies gently onto the stone, and for once, there was no guilt in her chest, only a deep and steady ache. The silence that followed was not the silence of suppression, but of truth honored in its purest form. Together, they stood, not as rivals in grief, not as sisters divided by secrets, but as two women acknowledging the same loss, the same father, the same weight of years lived in shadow. The act of laying the flowers was small, almost mundane, yet to Emily it felt monumental, a ritual of release, an offering of honesty that was long overdue. Emily unfolded the envelope slowly, the paper already worn from the number of times she had traced its edges in her pocket. It was Daniel's last letter, written before he disappeared from her life as quietly as he had entered. The handwriting was steady, unadorned, just like him. She read aloud, her voice soft but clear enough for Sarah to hear. "Your scars are not your shame. They are proof you survived." The words struck something deep inside her, resonating not as comfort from a stranger, but as a truth she had long needed to claim for herself. Sarah's eyes filled with tears as she listened, not because the words were hers, but because she understood how much they belonged to Emily. For years, scars had been the mark of blame, each one a reminder of silence, of secrets buried too deep. But now, standing at her father's grave with Daniel's message in her hands, Emily saw them differently. They weren't chains, they were testament. She had endured the storm, carried the weight, and still she stood. For Sarah, too, the words seemed to offer something, permission to grieve openly, to admit her role in the years of distance. Emily folded the letter once more, pressing it against her chest before tucking it away, as though sealing a final promise. She would no longer let shame define her life. As the afternoon light stretched across the cemetery, Emily took a breath that felt different, lighter, deeper, fuller than before. She glanced at Sarah, who gave a tentative smile, fragile but genuine. For the first time in years, Emily didn't feel alone. They began walking back toward the gates, their pace unhurried, the flowers left behind swaying in the wind like a quiet benediction. Emily didn't look back. She didn't need to. The past was no longer a cage tightening around her. It was a story she had finally learned to carry without shame. Daniel's words echoed in her mind, but now they belonged to her, not as guidance, but as truth she had claimed. Scars are survival. With Sarah beside her, not as a rival, not as an enemy, but as a sister, Emily stepped into a future that no longer felt haunted. Her shoulders, once hunched under the weight of silence, now squared themselves with quiet strength. The grave lay behind them, not as a wound, but as a reminder, and as they walked into the world beyond the iron gates, the closing image was one of release. Two sisters side by side, moving forward into a life built not on lies, but on the unbreakable foundation of truth.